Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this edition of my, I suppose, video podcast. Both my family and I have been very excited this month to get into the whole celebration of what happened 100 years ago. And it happened exactly on the 6th of December, 1921, where the British and the Irish signed a treaty called the Anglo-Irish Treaty. And for the first time, Ireland got its freedom. As you probably know, we had been under the thumb of Britain for 800 years and had many an attempt to try and get our freedom during that time. But we eventually got it on the 6th of December, 1921. And what my siblings and I have been discovering is that our family, both my mother's side and my father's side, were quite involved at that whole time. And we've been piecing together that whole story. And that's what I'd like to share with you today, because in every tradition, every culture, and every religion, our ancestry is important. And I think the reason for that is because we owe so much to the people who went before us. And it's important for us to remember them, and also for ourselves to get a sense of our own identity and who we are because of those people who went before. So I'm going to share with you my screen now, and I'm going to read the document that I put together to try and record this story for my family and for future generations. So there you are. I'm sharing the first slide with you now. Actually, it's probably not the first slide. There's the first slide. Michael Collins and My Family. Some of you may have heard of Michael Collins because there was a film made about him, and I believe it's still available on Netflix. He was one of the very famous revolutionary politicians at that time in 1921, and he subsequently got shot in a civil war which followed. But anyway, my family were connected with him in various ways during that period, and that's what this story is a record of. So here we go. On December the 6th, 1921, 100 years ago, the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed. And with this treaty, 26 counties of Ireland out of the 32 became a free state. The other 6 counties in the north of the country remained with Britain and do so to this day. The treaty laid the foundation for the Republic of Ireland, which we have today and which we celebrate today because of that momentous event. At that time, both of my parents, John Malloy and Evelyn Ryan, were only children. My father was 5 and my mother was 1. So they knew nothing about what was going on. Both families, well, the 2 families had lived 100 miles apart, so they didn't even know each other. And yet, strangely, looking back, both families had an intimate personal connection with this moment in history, and the actions of one family affected the other. And it's all to do with this man, Michael Collins. He was the main negotiator of this treaty. He wore 2 hats. He was both a politician, as you can see on the left, on the right, and a soldier, as you can see on the left. As a politician, he was the chairperson of the political party called Sinn Féin, which was a revolutionary party, although it had been elected. And he had become Minister for Finance in that new Irish Parliament, which they called the Dáil. As a soldier, on the other hand, he was the commander-in-chief of the Irish Volunteers, and this was a nationwide guerrilla army. So both sides of my family had a personal connection with this man. That is an extraordinary fact. My parents were only tiny. My mother's father, Michael J. Ryan, known as MJ, was a commandant of the 3rd Battalion Longford Brigade, a branch of the Irish Volunteers. So as such, his boss was this man, Michael Collins. These volunteers were set up in 1917, so 4 years before the treaty, as the military wing of the Irish movement for independence from Britain. An equivalent organization was set up also for women. This was called Cumann na mBan. And my grandmother, Alice Ryan, whose original surname was Shannon, was very involved in this organization in her hometown. So these are my grandparents, not as they were then, but as they were in 1955. They lived in Lanesborough, County Longford, but my grandfather, MJ, hailed from County Clare. And in 1917, he acted as Eamon de Valera's chauffeur on election day during the Clare by-election. And De Valera actually won this election with a landslide victory. Now that was quite a feat because at the time petrol was rationed and MJ was not allowed to travel more than 20 miles from his home, which was very far away from County Clare, I can tell you. But with the help of this famous Michael Collins, MJ commandeered a stash of petrol that got him all the way to County Clare. And to get there, he had to pass various police roadblocks. And he did this by using false number plates and giving false names and addresses. So when MJ and his wife Alice, my grandparents, had their first child the following year, they named him Eamon. Eamon was my uncle and the only boy in that family. By 1921, Eamon de Valera had become the leader of the Sinn Féin government in Dublin and a very key figure in the decades ahead of that in Ireland. He became Taoiseach, which is Prime Minister, and later he became President of Ireland. So with MJ and his wife Alice, with their first child, I've said that to you, my apologies. They named him Eamon. So my mother, Evelyn, was the second of this family to be born, and eventually had 6 children in total, 1 boy and 5 girls. Evelyn was born in 1920, in the middle of this War of Independence, January 1919 to December 1921. It lasted 2 years. So the war had begun when the elected representatives of this political party, Sinn Féin, refused to attend the British Parliament, which is what had been the case up to then. You got elected in Ireland, but you travelled to Britain to attend the Parliament. Instead, they set up their own rebel parliament called the Dáil in Dublin. And this led to the War of Independence. So during this war, my grandfather was an active service. He was in active service, planning raids, building up an arms store, leading his brigade, and evading capture. And earlier, he had campaigned for the election of his local Sinn Féin representatives, who were now in this new revolutionary parliament. So MJ recounts that Michael Collins came to them in Lanesborough on one occasion to sort out a split among his volunteers. On another occasion, MJ managed to procure a secret document from the police sergeant's office in Lanesborough. He did this by asking the wife of a constable, a woman who was sympathetic to the cause, to make an imprint of the key to the office on a bar of soap. A key was made, the document was retrieved, and it revealed that certain people were being watched by these police to ascertain when they would travel to Dublin for a volunteer convention. So MJ sent this document to the Dublin headquarters by messenger on a bicycle. That meant cycling over 100 miles, and it led to the cancellation of the volunteers convention. MJ subsequently got a letter of thanks from Michael Collins concerning this. So MJ was eventually captured and imprisoned in November 1920. And he had injured himself by making a landmine. And at that time, he wasn't at home, but on the run as a wanted man when he was injured. So, however, he decided that his wife would be worried about him. And so he came home to reassure her that he was alive. But that was a bad move because the Black and Tans, who were the British Special Force at the time, and they were very noted for their brutality, they got wind of his homecoming, surrounded his house, and he was captured. And I heard that Alice, my grandmother at that time, escaped by jumping out a window. And she had the baby, which was probably my mother, under one arm, and she had a cash box in the other. So my grandfather recorded all this years later, all this period of his life in a memoir, which was written down, typed up, and kept in the archive, the military archives, and it's available now online if anybody wants to read it. And I'll give you the link to it at the end. When MJ, my grandfather, was in prison, when he was captured, he was kept for a few days in Mountjoy Jail in Dublin, then transported by British warship to Belfast, where he and others were incarcerated without trial in Ballykindler prison. On the warship, they were handcuffed in fours and left up on deck all night and all day. The ship took 3 days to get to Belfast due to dense fog. And during this time, the men were outdoors without food or toilet facilities. And it was the middle of winter, you can imagine. They were then marched through Belfast to the railway station and on by train to the internment camp. And during the march, Orange men and Belfast people with their families lined the streets and hurled abuse and everything that they could find at them. One prisoner died and others went insane as a result of this treatment. It must have been hugely traumatic. So just over a year later, on December the 6th, 1921, the day the treaty was signed, they were released. And it was, of course, as a result of the signing of the treaty. And you see there a picture of some of the men who are released. And if you look at the top row on the right, second in from the right, is my grandfather. And that's how he looked. He would have been in his 30s at that stage, I would say. Now we go from there to my mother's side. That was my father's side. That was my mother's side. We go from there to my father's side, excuse me. And on my father's side, well, his mother, Julia, who was originally Lyons, had 5 children at this stage. So she was busy rearing her family and had no time for maybe politics, even if she was interested. However, my father was the 3rd child of that family. He was born in 1916, the year of the revolution in Dublin. But his mother had 2 sisters, and they were called Ellie and Alice Lyons. And they were younger, of course, and they were both single, and they had been trained as secretaries. They'd also grown up in the middle of Dublin. They had a house in Gardiner Street in the centre of Dublin. So when this new Irish Parliament was setting up in Dublin at this time, these 2 ladies were recruited as secretaries. Alice, the younger of the 2, she's on the left. She became Michael Collins' private secretary. So that was a fairly close connection with Michael Collins. Both of them turned out to be very respected and well regarded, especially for their aptitude, but also for their composure under stress. For example, during one British raid on the Dáil offices, Alice escaped capture by calmly opting to leave as the raid was beginning, giving rise to a rumour that Collins himself had escaped, disguised as a woman. Collins was a very, very big man, and Alice was quite tiny, actually. So it doesn't really fit that he could have escaped dressed as her. Anyway, Collins was sufficiently impressed by both of these sisters, my 2 granddads, to include them on the secretarial staff of the treaty delegation to London. And after the signing of the treaty, the 2 sisters were talked into staying on in London to clear up remaining documentation from the offices of the delegation before returning home to Dublin. So here are some of the photographs of them in London. And the 2 sisters are on the outside and on the inside, Alice and Eddie. And the woman in the middle is the 3rd secretary, a much taller woman, as you can see. And her name is Kathleen McKenna. And she has since written a book about her experience of this time. And here's a photograph of more of the members of the delegation. Again, not everybody's there. Michael Collins himself isn't there. Neither is Kathleen McKenna, the other secretary, but our 2 friends, my aunts, are both there. One of them is standing at the back in the middle, and the other is seated on the right. So here's the extraordinary thing, that the actions of my father's 2 aunts, Ellie and Alice, when my father was only 5 years old, led to the release from prison of my mother's father, MJ, when my mother was only 1 year old. And also, Michael Collins was the common denominator between them and knew all 3 of them, MJ, Ellie, and Alice, both by name and in person. John Malloy and Evelyn Ryan, my parents, were not to meet each other for another 20 years, but already their life stories had intertwined. Isn't that amazing? And here are some things that you can further have a look at if you're interested. So Michael Joseph Ryan, my grandfather, recounts this period of his life, 1917 to 1921, in a document stored in the Irish Military Archives. And it's an absolutely fascinating read. He gets up to all sorts of mischief and he records it all in this document. Then, of course, there's the film Michael Collins, which featured Liam Neeson, Stephen Ray, and Julia Roberts, among others, and was produced by Jim Sheridan. So well worth watching that. And then also at this time, you can do a virtual tour of the treaty exhibition at Dublin Castle by clicking on that link there below. So I hope you enjoyed that, and maybe it'll encourage you to research your own ancestors and to find out what happened in your family.